afternoon, everybody, or good morning, or good night, wherever you may be. Welcome to my conversation with Matt McClintock. We titled this Bitcoin in Your Portfolio. We're going to talk about all kinds of things to do with estate planning and everything else that you need to worry about once you do get wealthy with Bitcoin or any other cryptocurrency. Of course, read the disclaimer very, very carefully, word for word. I'm going to start out this thing by giving you a little bit of background on myself, and then I'll let Matt jump in and give us a little bit of a background of how he got into this whole topic. So I started, on the trading side, trading mortgage derivatives on Wall Street. Started to run a hedge fund for a bunch of years and started investing in trading and hedge fund strategies in the early 2000s from a platform called Protege Partners. We were a hedge fund seeder. We seeded over 40 hedge funds. We invested in hundreds of hedge funds. It was all kind of boring equity, credit, and things like that. And 2015, fortunately, we got involved in the digital asset space. We happened to get introduced to the MIT's Media Lab, where they were backing some of the Bitcoin core developers. It was a very, very intriguing and interesting technology. We got introduced to some of the early founders in the space, and we invested with some of them very early, and that really did very well. Certainly whetted our appetite. 2019, I went full-time into the digital asset space. And, ever since then, we've been running different portfolios. We have an asset manager. Samara Alpha Management is an asset manager that does various things in crypto. We can talk about all of those things another time. I want to start this off by taking a little bit of a poetic license and reading a quote from 1789. And if you listen carefully, you'll know what I changed in the quote, but it's very subtle. So it was Ben Franklin. He wrote it in a letter in 1789, and he said, "Our new Bitcoin is now established. Everything seems to promise it will be durable. But in this world, nothing is certain except death and taxes." So Matt McClintock, you deal with death and taxes. So do tell us, how did you get into this?
That's quite an introduction. Thanks, Adil. So a quick background about myself. I'm a career estate planner. This is now my 24th year. I have an active law practice right now, and that law practice has then kind of led to the formation of a multifamily office, which I'm sure we'll talk about in some detail. So I've spent over the last almost 2.5 decades where my practice, where my career was focused around how do you structure wealth for succession into future generations. Part of that has to deal with transfer tax, like the state or federal, gift tax, estate tax, generation skipping transfer tax, capital gains tax, things like that. But how you also do the tax planning in a broader context of establishing and maintaining privacy around personal wealth holdings, asset protection, especially for individuals who are in high liability exposure professions. How do you pass the wealth on to an inheriting generation, especially for people who have built wealth in one generation, structuring that in a way where there's stewardship and a sense of responsibility that goes along with that wealth. And really critically, and one of the things that we're super excited about is then the purpose behind the wealth, and then how often that translates into philanthropic activities with ultra wealthy families. So that was my career for, like I said, 2.5 decades almost. And in 2017, I was introduced to an individual who had about $150 million worth of Bitcoin in 2017. And as is probably not terribly surprising, they were having an impossible time trying to find somebody who could do comprehensive estate planning for them with Bitcoin. Because everybody knows how to do this with conventional assets, but nobody was really doing this with Bitcoin or other digital assets. And I was not familiar with Bitcoin. My business partner and our team was not familiar with Bitcoin, but we do kind of have this insatiable curiosity. And so sat down with these folks and was intrigued by this prospect of having this digital asset that does not exist anywhere except on a digital ledger somewhere, but is worth millions and millions, or in this case, hundreds of millions of dollars. And as I learned more about Bitcoin and I learned more about the broader crypto space, I had this realization that if we could simply figure out how to document the transfer of ownership from an individual who has Bitcoin to a tax optimized or other type of legal structure that owns that Bitcoin, then everything that we've ever done for conventional wealth is on the table. And so that was my first foray into the Bitcoin space, and that was the fourth quarter of 2017.
Wow, that was way in the beginning.
Well, I mean, it's not 2015, Adil. I mean,
I didn't have 150 million worth of Bitcoin back then.
Yeah. So, but anyway, kind of made to land this last chapter of this part of the story is through the work that we did for that individual. A lot of the structuring was around privacy, asset protection, and some tax optimization, which meant that the individual could no longer directly control the assets inside the various structures that we had established. And they needed somebody to kind of help them with real estate management. And that's just solving for a very practical problem for this person. And we ended up forming a company called Bespoke. It was tailor-made for what that client needed. We were going to serve as turned out to be their first fractional family office, sitting on real estate, managing real estate projects for them. And then as our knowledge and comfort with Bitcoin and the broader crypto space evolved, we started helping with multi-signature wallet and vault controls, facilitating custodial setups for them, borrowing, lending, facilitating private banking, and all this kind of stuff, just like a good family office does. And the word kind of gets out that we're now the guys who can do structured estate planning and provide comprehensive family office services for people with significant amounts of crypto. And really from 2018 forward, that's when we kind of became full-time in the crypto space. And we've gotten to the point now where I have not personally taken on a client in the last 2.5 years that does not have high 8 figures or 9 figures worth of Bitcoin or other digital assets.
Wow, that's great. I mean, I did not even know that there was a specialized firm like this until like a few weeks ago, but that's fantastic. So maybe, and look, one of the things is that there's lots of people who are quickly going from no figure to 9 figure, back to no figure, back to 9 figures. So the wealth is being created and destroyed very, very quickly in this space. Yep. And so for somebody who's coming at it, like maybe from nothing, maybe they have something, at what point should a individual start worrying about this? I mean, not about dying necessarily, but about, what happens after death. Is it when you have 100,000 million? Is there some ramp, or is it all or none? Can you sort of guide people in like when they should really start to think about this seriously?
Yeah, for sure. And I don't know that I don't know that there's a quantitative answer as much as there's a qualitative answer. The way I would answer the question is that when it is materially important to the person, then it's worth planning for, because it's very easy, I think, to focus on tax-oriented planning. We do it all the time. You have.
Sorry, what was that? Tax?
Yeah,
tax-oriented.
Tax-oriented planning. It's very easy to focus on tax-oriented planning because it's easily quantifiable. You know how much taxes you're going to pay each year, and you can predict with a high level of certainty what your estate tax liability will be. If you're under the estate tax exemption threshold, which we can certainly talk about at some length, then you don't have to worry about the estate tax. You might have to worry about capital gains tax. You might have a state level estate tax, but most people don't have a federal estate tax problem here in the US. So very often the conversation around estate planning hinges around taxes because it's not emotional, it's quantifiable, and you can solve it with math. So the harder part, I think, of estate planning is these kind of human issues, like, how do I protect my spouse or my partner when something happens to me? if in the case of digital assets, how can I make sure that they actually know that we have the digital assets, know how to recover the digital assets, know how to manage those, whether it's liquidating that, if it's something super thinly liquidated or subject to a lockup, how are they going to manage those assets? There's practical issues around that. How do we protect that spouse or that partner of ours if they remarry after we die? And then how do we ultimately protect the other people that we really care about? For some of our clients, it's their parents and their siblings and their nieces and nephews. For some of them, it's their own children. For some of them, they want to kind of create this family legacy that cascades into the future. So I would say that the moment that you start to worry about this, or that you start to think about it, is when you realize that my wealth in this space is material, and it would really kind of suck if I don't have a plan for that. And so the level of complexity goes up, the more we add zeros to the to the right of to the left side of the decimal point. But I think anybody whose wealth is material to them should engage in some type of estate planning, because as Satoshi Franklin rightly said, there's two things that are absolutely certain, and that's death and taxes. And you're not going to solve either one of those without some type of intentional estate plan.
You're trying to solve both. Wow, that's
yeah,
that's quite something. So if you have real estate, you have other types of known assets. I guess the disposition and kind of figuring out who owns what is all in title and that type of thing. Is there really some special technology or special legal stuff that's now being developed for private keys and how that works? Like, what if you had kept your private keys in somebody else's house? Now, like, what makes it yours? Like, is there how does any of this actually practically work in terms of crypto? It seems difficult.
Yeah, there are actually a lot of layers to that question. So I'll try to move through them quickly, but as you kind of point out, Bitcoin and other digital assets are referred to as digital bearer instruments or bearer assets, like a block of gold, like a stack of cash. There's not a title to Bitcoin or to ETH or something like that. Now, there certainly is title to a custodial account if you have your Bitcoin or Ether or other crypto at some type of custodian, and we can even talk about different grades of custodians if we want to. But when you're talking about just privately maintained key material, you're exactly right. How do you establish the ownership of that? In the case of any bearer asset like Bitcoin, like gold, like a stack of cash, there is no title to that. So for all practical purposes, unless somebody can prove otherwise, possession is ownership.
So finders keepers. If somebody dies, you grab their private keys. Now it's yours. I mean, that's very chaotic.
It certainly can be. I mean, again, it's not legally that way, because if you happen to drop a stack of $1,000 bills somewhere and I walk behind you and I pick that up, I know that's not mine. I might not know it's yours, but I know it's not mine. So I have committed a conversion, or I've committed a crime against the owner of that property. So from a practical matter, yes, it is finders keepers. From a legal matter, no, it is not. But again, on a bearer asset like this, how are you going to prove it? And so when we're dealing with any bearer asset, artwork, jewelry, anything like that, it becomes a matter of documenting ownership, not in the form of writing your private keys in some type of estate planning document, but saying that I have these assets. This is where my key material is. This is where my signature devices are stored, whether it's MetaMask on a laptop, whether it is a peripheral device or a smartphone or something like that that's got a warm wallet on it, whether it's private key, signature, cold storage material, things like that. Just documenting that you have that, because the biggest problem that you're often trying to solve if you become incapacitated, and certainly when you die, is being sure that the person or people that you trust the most know that you have these assets and then know how to recover those assets. So if you have your key material sharded and scattered around to multiple friends' houses, you should leave a trail of breadcrumbs for your spouse or your partner or your kids or whomever to know, okay, go to my friend's house, go to my sister's house, go to my brother's house, and then assemble these shards so you can then recover my key material. And that, again, is more of a practical conversation than really a legal technical observation. But we can certainly get into some of the legal and technical implications of how you create a succession path for digital assets, or again, any bearer asset. And it's part of a more comprehensive look at how an estate plan should come together.
So in that sort of equation or equality, you're saying having some gold bars or having some crypto asset is very similar. It's just how you the operational aspects might be different, but from your aspect of what type of trust to set up or where to put it or how many generations, it's the same, and you're just applying the old precedents to this new asset class and making sure that there are no holes. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. I mean, there are certain nuances with digital assets that are new that I believe sound estate planning strategies ought to contemplate. But really, by and large, we are dealing with a bearer asset that is of unusual value. And in the case of Bitcoin and ETH and most crypto assets, we're dealing with fungible digital bearer assets, kind of like gold coins or something like that. So to a certain degree, the comparison to jewelry and certain precious metals begins to break down because, jewelry is almost like a physical version of an NFT. Right. A piece of jewelry is unique. It's just as physically unique and has collectible value as a result of that. Same with artwork. With Bitcoin or Ether, it is a lot more like kind of unmarked gold bullion or something like that. Some gold might have markings on them or certain provenance that makes it more valuable than something else, but the value of the gold itself is based on its weight and purity. And so gold is, precious metals and these other types of tangible physical assets like that are easier to secure because they exist in a physical form. And so you can have a vault at your house, at a bank, in some free port in Switzerland or whatever. And that vault in a free port, for example, has your name on it or the name of something that owns that vault. If it's in a vault or a safe at your house, then again, presumably, if the safe is in your house, the house is titled in your name, or ideally some trust or other entity that you own or that you're kind of associated with, then it's a clear presumption that that vault and the contents are yours. In the case of Bitcoin or crypto, then who's to say that if I could just guess your seed phrase or whatever, I can recover your Bitcoin and none's the wiser because it doesn't exist in the physical realm. If I mug you someday and I find that you've got a signature device somewhere and I'm savvy enough to figure out how to access your crypto, I can drain your crypto, I can hack you, and it's gone. And so in the crypto realm, obviously the security protocols are much more. There's a much wider attack vector when we're dealing with securing these assets.
Something you said prompted the question is it must be very different in other jurisdictions other than the US too, correct? Like every jurisdiction is very different, because I know in India for a while they had a wealth tax. Mm-hmm. Now, not just an income tax, but a wealth tax. And I think other places have had that in the past. And if you have that, then the equation changes drastically of how you deal with this during your life versus post.
Right.
Are you involved with foreigners who hold this stuff and trying to navigate through their crazy tax shenanigans?
Yeah, I would say that we don't usually do non-U.S. tax-oriented planning. We do some kind of U.S. tax-oriented planning for people who are either U.S. persons living abroad or non-U.S. persons seeking to come into the United States. So we do kind of directly help with some of that. We have partners that we work with around the world in various jurisdictions that can address those issues for them if they happen to be in India or the UK or wherever. But there's certainly the tax element. But again, a lot of what we should solve for in the broader estate planning context goes beyond the taxes and goes into things like privacy. How can we own a piece of property that is highly private and or inside of a framework that can withstand many generations into the future? And so, here in the United States, very often we'll use various types of trusts, and there's almost innumerable types and variations of trusts that you can establish. There are also other corporate type entities like limited liability companies and partnerships, all within the United States.
On the privacy, are you suggesting, the problems with getting doxxed and people then becoming like a physical liability where you might be at risk?
Precisely.
I see. Got it.
Yeah, precisely. Because whether you're in the crypto space or not, highly affluent people are often successful business owners. Sometimes they're celebrities, or they're just kind of well-known entrepreneurs, and they want to enjoy their wealth without the attention of curiosity seekers. And so, various trusts, various other entities, whether they're created in the United States or somebody in the United States creating non-US entities to own assets, can provide screens of privacy so that, if an individual is super successful and super affluent and they want to go buy a home on a mountaintop somewhere, they don't want people to know who owns that house or where they happen to live. Various strategies can be put into motion to keep that individual out of the chain of title, so curiosity seekers have a much harder time trying to figure out where these people live. We've seen it where clients who have unfortunately taken a photo of themselves in front of the tail number of their jet, no joke, end up having their kids followed to school. And so, just because it's very easy to link a specific asset with a specific identifier on it, like it's a tail number or like a parcel number for a piece of real estate or whatever, to an individual, and then sometimes some dangerous things can happen. And that's just the reality of life with ultra high net worth.
Right. Now, maybe switching gears a little bit about, to income tax for just a second. I know income tax is not the forefront of this type of tax that we're talking about, but I was actually frankly surprised that there were specialists in income versus transfer or whatever. So for the benefit of the audience, could you just do a 10,000 foot kind of thing of like, what's an income tax versus a transfer tax? What are the different kinds? Because there's a relationship, right? I mean, like your transfer is not just during death. I mean, you could transfer assets some other time. And in my mind, and maybe this is incorrect, is that I'm thinking of even investing in something is like a transfer, right? Is that even relevant? Like when you invest in a fund or something, is that considered just because I mean, the reason why I originally got interested in all of this very much is that, we have played around, and other people, with Bitcoin denominated funds versus regular currency denominated funds like USD denominated funds. And the tax treatment of entering into that transaction of investing in the fund is demonstrably different, I found out. And there's some advantages and disadvantages, but there's this interplay of income tax, transfer tax. It's a little bit confusing. I'll leave it to you to maybe confuse us more, or at least give us an overview of how to think about this thing.
Yeah. Well, as you rightly point out, I think to the extent I've got any tax expertise, it's on the transfer tax side, but I'll kind of define some terms as you're talking about here. Income tax is what we get to pay every year based on either our earned income, whether it's W-2 income, 1099 income, dividends that we might receive from investments, and to a certain degree, capital gains tax. Capital gains is a form of income. And so there's earned income that you get from your compensation or just being paid in service for something else. If you're a member of a board somewhere and you receive some type of compensation as a result of your service on that board, whether that compensation is paid in a currency like the dollar or the Swiss franc or whatever, or whether your compensation is paid in the form of property like Bitcoin or like Ether or like some other piece of property, you have to report the income equal to the value of what you received. And so then you would pay income tax on that compensation. So when we have been paid extensively in Bitcoin for various services through the years, we have to report that Bitcoin at the moment. We have to establish the value at the time it's received, and that is the value of compensation on which we will pay income tax on our annual income tax return.
So in that case, just to be clear, you have to pay it immediately, not when you dispose of that thing that you gain, that you got.
That's correct, because what you're distinguishing now is ordinary income versus capital gains income, Adil. So when I receive Bitcoin in compensation, let's say that I was lucky enough to be paid $10,000 when Bitcoin was worth $10,000. So, I send you an invoice for my services. It's $10,000. You pay me in Bitcoin worth $10,000. Great. I report Bitcoin. When I file my income tax return at the end of the year, I report that I received $10,000 worth of income from you. The IRS doesn't care if I receive that $10,000 in US dollars or in the Swiss franc or in Bitcoin. It's $10,000 because you paid my invoice denominated as this, and you paid me in an asset worth that amount. So, but here's where things get really interesting. There is no capital gains treatment on cash, but there is capital gains treatment on property, and Bitcoin is considered property by the IRS. So let's say that I received $10,000 worth of Bitcoin earlier in the year, and then I hold that for less than 1 year. And then I dispose of it when my $10,000 worth of Bitcoin is now $50,000 worth of Bitcoin. If I dispose of that Bitcoin, if I sell that Bitcoin, if I trade it for ETH, if I do anything else that the IRS would consider a tax recognition event, I will now have a capital gains tax. I paid my $10,000 of ordinary income tax, but I also now have a basis of $10,000. That's the value I acquired that Bitcoin at. If that $10,000 worth of Bitcoin is now worth $50,000 worth of Bitcoin, I have $40,000 worth of gain that I now get to pay capital gains tax on. And if I have held that Bitcoin for less than 1 year, the capital gains tax rate is the same as my ordinary income tax rate. If I have held that Bitcoin for longer than a year, it's under the long-term capital gains tax rate, which is a much lower rate. And that's graduated from, I think, 0 to about 20-ish%, if memory serves. Again, I'm not an income tax expert, but that's like the very high level view of income tax. There's ordinary income that you need to think about, and there's capital gains tax that you need to think about. The world that I inhabit primarily centers around what we refer to as transfer tax. And that's your example, Adil, when you trade Bitcoin or when you invest Bitcoin or other assets into a fund, that's not a transfer under the transfer tax rules. It's a capital gains recognition event under the capital gains tax rules. A transfer is if you give a piece of property or you give money, you give anything to somebody who is not tax exempt. So if I were to just give you out of the goodness of my heart $10,000 worth of Bitcoin, then that gift, I'm not going to, but if I did,
I'm very nice.
I mean, you have to be really nice to me. But if I were to give you $10,000 worth of Bitcoin, then that would be a reportable gift subject to the federal gift tax rules. However, there is an exemption on the first. This year, the exemption is $18,000. I could have given you up to $18,000 worth of anything this year, and there's no gift tax on it. It's just an exempt gift. But if I gave you $20,000 worth of Bitcoin this year, then the first $18,000 would not count as a reportable gift, as a taxable gift. It would be reportable, but there would be no tax because the first $18,000 is covered by my annual exclusion. But the additional $2,000 is now subject to tax at 40%. that I have to pay, not you, that I have to pay. So the transfer tax is a tax on the right of an individual or the privilege of an individual to give their property to someone else who is not a tax exempt person. Now, who's tax exempt? Qualifying charities like the Red Cross or Red Crescent or any number of charitable organizations, those don't count against your gift exemption amount. If you are married if you are a U.S. person, married to a U.S. person, there is an unlimited amount that you can gift your spouse. You can give them millions or billions of dollars, and there's no gift tax if you gift to your spouse. Now, why is that? Well, because the IRS knows that, well, they'll just tax it when your spouse dies. So you can give it to your spouse now, but then the estate tax will hit for transfers that take place at death. And so that's the transfer tax rules. And I guess the last.
Sorry. I'm going to forget my question because this is very interesting. So you're saying if I give somebody $1 million, I have to pay 40% of that, or like it'll cost me like $1,400,000 because I have to give 400,000 to the government?
Great question. The answer is it depends, because that's just how it is. You have a lifetime gift exclusion amount, and under the current 2017 Tax Act that was signed by President Trump back in 2017, every American taxpayer, whether you're a longtime, permanent resident, longtime green holder, or a U.S. citizen living anywhere in the world, you can give up to $13.61 million during your lifetime without any gift tax. The first dollar beyond that will be subject to the gift tax rules. So the cool thing to remember here is that $13.61 million, you have that. If you're married, your spouse has that as well. So a married couple, and they have to be a married couple, can double their exemption. So it's 13.61 times 2 is what a married couple can use in structuring tax optimized gifts, whether that is in trusts to their descendants, trusts to their siblings, trusts for each other in ways that get the value out of the estate.
Right,
So if you gave me $25 million today,
right,
you would use up the first 13.61 million of your exemption, and then the first dollar over that would be subject to transfer tax.
But if I gave you 13.6 million or whatever, 13.4, and then somebody else another 13.4, is that fine, or is it like the 13.4 is the total amount that I can give?
Total amount across all non-exempt beneficiaries.
All right. And what's the rationale for that? I'm still a little, look, I don't think I need to figure out a rationale for the government taxation. I think taxation is great. It builds roads and schools and all that. I'm pro for it. But in this case, if I just want to give somebody money, let's say I gave 10 people 13 point, when they die, then there'll be an estate tax there. So why do they want to get me at this stage as well? What was the rationale for that?
Well, I think the biggest rationale is that affluent families are not sympathetic or they're not sympathetic for the general public. They're kind of an easy target to go tax. The estate tax affects less than 0.1% of the entire American population. So we're talking about, now it's 100% of my clients, and it's probably 100% of listeners here, but it's just a minuscule percentage of the U.S. population. So you're talking about a 40% tax that only hits the top 1% of the top 1% of people in the United States. So it's a great thing to campaign on. You're not going to get a lot of sympathy from the rank and file voters out there. Sure, tax the rich because they've got plenty. That's the general thesis behind it. And why do you tax estates? Well, because dead people don't sue. And it's easy to tax a dead person because they're not really going to complain about it. So, unfortunately, it is a usurious rate. It's currently 40%. And this 2017 Tax Act that I'm referring to here, that Tax Act will automatically expire. Congress doesn't have to do anything at all. And that that law will expire by its own, under its own weight at the end of next year. So 12/31 of 2025, unless Congress proactively does something different, which I don't hold out a lot of hope for, then the estate tax exemption, which it's a combined gift and estate tax exemption. You can either use it during your lifetime or you use it at your death. Mm-hmm. If you use it during your lifetime, you have no exemption left when you die. So we can kind of circle back to that. But the exemption amount is $10 million per taxpayer plus adjustments for inflation over time. So if you look at the 2017 Tax Act, what the Tax Act did is it doubled your standard exemption from $5 million per taxpayer to $10 million per taxpayer plus adjustments for inflation. That's how we get to 13.61 in this calendar year. Now, next year we'll get another inflation adjustment, but then at the end of 2025, if Congress doesn't proactively extend the tax code, then we wake up January of 2026 and that $10 million exemption plus inflation just got cut back to $5 million plus indexing for inflation. So for people who are more affluent, again, probably the vast majority of people that you and I know, they need to proactively use this high estate tax exemption. Now you can proactively use that in planning through various trust structures that get the value of assets out of your estate using your $13.6 million exemption amount now, and then all the future growth on that 13.6, once you get that out of your estate from a transfer tax perspective, all that future growth will escape estate tax potentially forever, depending on what jurisdictions you use. So you can actually, Adil, you could use your $13.6 million exemption. If you're married, you could use that for your spouse in a non-deductible way. Your spouse could do the same thing for you. And now you've created trusts effectively for each other so that you can still benefit from these assets, but all the growth is now out of your estates. So you can take that 27-ish million bucks, put those in protective trusts where you have privacy, you have asset protection, you have proactively now used your gift and estate tax exemption amount. And if that $27 million grows to $100 million before you die, all the better, because all of that growth will not be taxed when you and your spouse later die. And if the trust is structured properly, then when your children die, when your grandchildren die, when your great-grandchildren die, so long as those assets remain in trust, it can provide benefits for your beneficiaries, but so long as the corpus or the principle of the trust remains inside the trust, it can escape this transfer tax for generations and generations. So instead of having the estate tax erode wealth by 40% chunks at a time at every generation, you can just let it ride, let it roll, and let it grow. But you have to be proactive in using that gift tax exemption for your lifetime. So sorry, I get on the soapbox about this because this is my world. So, I mean, I love transfer tax stuff.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like a puzzle. A trust that you set up, it needn't be set up for your children or beneficiaries or whatever, right? I mean, it could be a way to direct your earned income or your savings to some other cause without having to pay that type of tax at the estate tax as well, right? So there could be, I mean, I'm not necessarily thinking charitable, but just for some other purpose, like for something that you want to do, in a particular part of the world, reforestation, what have you. Is that correct as well?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, when I formed Bespoke, when my business partner and I formed Bespoke, I put my founder's equity in an irrevocable trust that was for the benefit of my wife and my children. So the value inside that trust is not only protected from an asset protection perspective, it's outside of my estate from an estate tax perspective. I also have put the vast majority of my Bitcoin in that same trust for the benefit of my wife and my children. So yes, my kids are beneficiaries of that, but my wife is the primary beneficiary of that. And so so long as we stay married, which, hopefully we stay married forever, then, all the family gets to benefit from those assets. But when I later die, if Bespoke has become this really valuable thing, or if Bitcoin goes, parabolic, which it's, certainly looking pretty good right now, then all of that growth is outside of my estate. And the way the trust is structured, it's outside of my wife's estate, and it's outside of my children's estate as well. So that my wife can benefit from that trust. I can benefit indirectly through my wife, and my children can benefit from that trust. And that's what I did in 2017 when I formed my company. But you can certainly do what you're talking about too. You can create what are called purpose trusts that exist for the benefit of some cause. Maybe it is philanthropic, maybe it's charitable, like I cannot remember the name of the founder of Patagonia Company, but he restructured into a B corporation and effectively gave the vast majority of the equity, the value of Patagonia, to charitable causes for climate issues. You can certainly do that kind of stuff. Trusts, really at their core, all a trust is a legal relationship under which you, as the creator of that trust, entrust certain assets under the supervision of a trustee for the benefit of individuals or causes. That's really all it is. And then a trust can take any number of different shapes depending on what it is that you're seeking to achieve.
So in your sort of travels through the crypto and Bitcoin community, two things that come to my mind are that, is it really different if it's some other crypto or Bitcoin, or it's pretty much the same? Like that aspect of it doesn't matter, like Bitcoin being property, or Ether potentially being, or something being a security or not a security. All of that is irrelevant to this conversation. Is that fair to say? That
is fair to say. I mean, if ETH is or is not a security, that's kind of immaterial, because securities are property, just like commodities are property.
Right.
So yeah, it's
that's not a consideration.
So it's NFTs, meme coins, whatever.
Right. So what are some of the are there any really bad mistakes that people have made? It's like, oh my God, how could you do this? Like in this realm, like what's some of the oh my God?
Yeah, the kind that made you just slap your head.
You don't have to name any names, but I
certainly wouldn't. I certainly wouldn't. There are, we definitely have some clients who have somehow survived the proverbial self-inflicted gunshot wounds when it comes to planning. They, one client came to us, her son was one of the founders of a very well-known protocol. This was back in 2018. And this protocol was it was ripping back then. And he was one of the founders. He's one of the lead developers, and he had hundreds of thousands of their tokens. And I think all told, it was about $9.5 or $10 million worth of that crypto asset. And it was fairly liquid. So, there was demonstrable wealth there. Well, this individual died, the son died very suddenly, and didn't tell mom, who was the woman I was working with. She knew that he worked for some crypto company, but had no idea about crypto. He hadn't said how much anything was worth. He happened to live and die in a jurisdiction, in a state here that has both a high state income tax and a high high state income tax and a high state estate tax. And mom spent the following 18 months or so working with the corporate treasury of the platform that the son was a builder on, just to try to get his assets. During that period of time, the market valuation of that asset plummeted from about 10 million bucks that this client would have had to about $1 million. So she lost about $9 million worth of value just because the son had not created a plan around crypto assets. So that's probably the most glaring example.
No, actually, that let's say that had happened, but when he died, it was worth 10 million, right? But then whenever it was kind of something could be done, it was 1 million. Would you be paying taxes on the 10 million or on the 1 million?
It depends on the time that has elapsed from the time you died until the time you recover it, because you can do what's called an alternate valuation date on some property under the estate tax code, but it has to be within 6 months of the date of death. So,
right.
if it's worth 10 million bucks and everything is bullish, and then, 9 or 10 or 12 months later, Terra Luna melts down and Three Arrows Capital collapses and FTX goes out, and now the market just sucks all the way back. Right. Too bad. When you died, it was worth 10 million. You get to pay taxes on the 10 million, but now it's only worth 1. And so, really failing to create a plan in advance, you lose liquidity options. If you just can't get access to the assets, you can't move when the market moves. And often I think the other thing that a lot of crypto people, especially more of the old school folks, are starting to finally, I think, come to terms with is this realization. They think that they can just pass their keys on to somebody else and the IRS will be none the wiser. I think those days are over. The IRS and the federal government is getting very good at understanding how blockchains work. And the blockchain, as you know, is an immutable ledger. So
they've been very successful. I think the Treasury owns like $1 bazillion of confiscated crypto. I mean, they're being very successful in the crypto world, the government, because of the transparency.
Yeah, for sure. And so if you think that you're just going to pass your key material off to your spouse or your kids or whatever, you might succeed in the mechanical transfer of that asset. But then what happens when your spouse or children want to monetize that Bitcoin? At some point, they're going to get KYC'd. And the question is going to be, where did this Bitcoin come from? Well, my dad left that to me 5 years ago. Okay, did you report that at that time? You might have estate tax liability off of that. If you knowingly received it and failed to report it, you might have criminal fraud charges brought against you. You're certainly going to have penalties and interest that accrue from the date that you received it. So the lesson I try to keep harping on is that these are real world assets. These are assets of significant value. They need to be respected as such. You wouldn't be capricious. You shouldn't be capricious about how you plan for your brokerage accounts, your private equity interests, or your real estate holdings, or your artwork, or whatever. You shouldn't be capricious about your crypto either. It's complicated, and I think because it is complicated, it really requires a higher level of attention to planning, because the other side of it too is pretty much every sophisticated fiduciary, a trustee or a spouse or a adult child, can figure out what to do with real estate, equities portfolios, even private equity or collectibles. But what are they going to do with crypto? Because often what we see is in a married couple, maybe one of the spouses is really familiar and comfortable with crypto and the other one's not, or maybe both of them are and the kids aren't.
Right.
I've had conversations just within the last 3 weeks with people who are in their 80s and 70s who have tens of millions of dollars worth of Bitcoin and ETH with very low basis. These were Ethereum pre-miners in their 70s and 80s, and their kids who are Ivy Leaguers say, "Mom and Dad, what are you doing with that stupid stuff? That's just crazy stuff." So the kids don't understand it, but Mom and Dad are someday going to die, and these kids are not prepared for the complexity of the asset. So this is what we see all the time come through our office.
Wow, that's funny. The example of the the unfortunate young man with the protocol who died unexpectedly. That seems like just like a mistake as far as like, how would you just didn't tell people where they were? Again, it would have been similar with some other gold bar or diamonds or anything. It's just, as you say, it's just another piece of property. You just didn't tell people where it was, and and that was that. That's weird. So we're getting on to about 50 minutes here. I want to make sure that if there's a topic that I haven't asked you about that is very relevant to some of the people in the audience, which, I think you touched on one thing, is founders. Like if somebody is founding a new protocol, we already know that this thing can go from zero to hero very quickly. Is there some like quick trick they can do so that they don't end up with some, strange liability because they own a very valuable stock?
It's tough because as you know, in crypto, it can go from zero to hero to zero in the course of a few weeks, and so the last thing I think somebody would want to do would be to plan prematurely and kind of end up over planning with more complexity than they really need if this protocol looks like it's really taking off and all of a sudden there's some type of fatal flaw or there's a market collapse that just, sucks all that value back out. So that's tough on founders tokens. Now there are certainly strategies that you can do, and we've done a lot of founders works for people who have, say that you're a top 20 protocol and you're one of the founders of that. Okay, well, you probably have more than just your token. You probably have Bitcoin, you probably have ETH. And, if you're already kind of in the, I'd say mid 8 figures from a total balance sheet perspective, then that's probably when you should start doing some heavy lifting around the estate planning context. And just be mindful of the fact that as your project gains traction, you need to be taking these assets seriously, because if you're dedicating your life's work to building this protocol and there is a token associated with that protocol, you obviously are bullish on the value of your token. Otherwise, you probably shouldn't have issued one. So I think it's one of those things that just should be part of the founder's mental checklist to say, okay, well, as we're talking about our devs, as we're building out our board, as we're thinking about the jurisdictions where we're going to launch, the platforms, all this kind of stuff, our tie-ins, our bridge protocols, all this kind of stuff, they should also be thinking about what does my work mean to my family if someday I don't show up for work tomorrow? How are they going to get a hold of my founders tokens? Even if they're locked up, how are they going to be able to get a claim against what I've spent my life in the last handful of years building? And then as liquidity deepens and as your shitcoin project becomes the next Ethereum, then it's like, okay, or the next Optimism or the next Chainlink or the next really successful protocol that's driving, it's like, okay, wait, this is material now. We can start planning. I think that there's a fine line, and unfortunately it's kind of a murky line between never planning at all and trying to do too much too soon. And a lot of what we have really tried to build bespoke to help navigate and this is part of the value proposition of the family office, is to come alongside these young founders and these early entrepreneurs as a family office for them and just be their guide in the process and say, maybe it's now time to start thinking about offshoring some of your wealth. Maybe it's time to start diversifying out with, if you can figure out ways that we can create liquidity without dumping the market or whatever. Or if you're long on your tokens, are there ways that we can structure those tokens such that the future beta is out of your estate on the growth? And the answer is yes, but it's not one of those things I think you should just enter in capriciously and assume that you're just going to find some form somewhere, sign it, and it's going to solve the problems. It needs to be heavily consultative, I think, especially in the crypto space and certainly in the high net worth space.
Yeah. You mentioned something. You said offshore some of your estate offshore. It sounds like people are offshoring themselves and like moving entire countries. Where is that even worth doing? I mean, like, are you seeing people leave the United States just because they are too wealthy? I mean, is that happening?
No, so most people are not offshoring for tax purposes, because if you're already a U.S. taxpayer and you decide that you're going to expatriate, then you're going to pay an exit tax, which is a basically mark-to-market capital gains tax on the total value of your assets. So the expatriation tax is astronomical. So most people do not offshore for tax purposes unless they're moving to Puerto Rico under the Act 60 regime, where they can take capital gains under a much lower structure. That's a different thing. No, most people in the crypto space that we're talking to are offshoring, sadly, because the regulatory climate in the U.S. is quite hostile to crypto. We've seen that it's not just the SEC, although they're certainly part of the problem. There's a lot more innovation happening in other jurisdictions. And so a lot of talent is leaving the United States to go to those other jurisdictions. Now, the US is still a very deep capital market. It's the deepest capital market in the world. But a lot of clients want outside of the regulatory overreach of the United States. And I'll tell you, a lot of them also just want non-dollarized investments. Even if they stay in the United States, they shouldn't move just for taxes. They should be where they want to live. If they want to live in the United States, that's great. But once you're highly affluent, again, probably mid 8 figures and above, you should start looking at moving some of your assets beyond the reach of the US regulatory regime, maybe putting some deposits in Switzerland or in Liechtenstein or in Singapore or something like that, and having some of your assets not denominated in the US dollar, having some of your assets denominated in harder currencies like the Norwegian krona or
Like
the
Bitcoin.
something like that, or Bitcoin. Absolutely. There's probably been no better inflation hedge ever. But then if your Bitcoin is in your self-custody, if you are self-custodying your Bitcoin and you're in the United States, you're still under, you could still have that Bitcoin seized potentially if you get sued or whatever. And if you're using a US custodian, then that US custodian could potentially be forced to hand over your Bitcoin under a really bad set of legal facts. But if you at least put some of your Bitcoin or other crypto assets offshore, you could use an offshore trust or some other offshore entity. That offshore trust or entity could then enter into a qualified custodial relationship in yet a third jurisdiction like Switzerland, Liechtenstein, or Singapore. And now you have expatriated some of your assets, not from a tax perspective, but from a regulatory risk perspective, and to a certain degree from a perspective.
Right. No, that's fair, because you never know what political climate happens in any country. Countries change over time. You never know. I mean, there was a time when the United States put Japanese people behind bars. I mean, there was all kinds of strange things.
And
who knows
what will happen? Your gold, and seized your gold. And I think the thing I would want people to take from the idea of moving things offshore is be careful where you move it. We are, we are very conservative when it comes to selecting jurisdictions. We favor the rule of law over the rule of man. And there are a lot of people in crypto who are moving assets to Dubai, and Dubai is a very interesting place. However, if there's a regime change in the UAE, there's not a long track record of private legal rights to ownership in the UAE. It's a rule of man type of jurisdiction. And so to a certain degree, yes, everything is welcoming and warm and fuzzy right now, but that can change. And there's not a long track record of rule of law in a place like that. There is, although we've got regulatory pressures in the US, we still have rule of law. But there's great rule of law in Switzerland, great rule of law in Liechtenstein, in Canada, to some degree.
You said Singapore? Singapore is also good?
Singapore is getting there. Singapore is improving. We don't currently have any client deposits in Singapore, but we've got a relationship with a qualified custodian out there. So if it becomes advantageous, then we can certainly do that.
Yeah. So, we're running out of time. I want to make sure that you tell the audience a little bit of where to find more information about this topic. Also, your firm, and how do they get in touch with you? Is there a website?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Yeah. So the website is just bespokegroup.io. So that's www.bespokegroup, bespokegroup.io. That's the landing page for the family office. I'm somewhat active on Twitter. My handle is just my last name. So McClintock _M. So that's MCCLINTOCK_M. I'm also on LinkedIn. You can find me just by looking at my name, Matt McClintock, cross-reference that to Bespoke Group, and you can find me there. That's probably the best way to get a hold of me. I do a lot of podcasts. I do a fair bit of writing and presenting on these topics. If folks are interested in what we're doing, I'd certainly welcome a conversation.
Yeah, fabulous. And so, and the audience, I'm, again, Adil Abdulali. Our firm is Samara Alpha Management. There's a website, www.samara-am.com. We have lots of content there. We have very interesting investments in all kinds of things, Bitcoin denominated, USD denominated, hedge funds, and everything else you could think about. Would love to talk to any of you. And thank you very much, Matt. This was very entertaining and also informative. I always worry about taxes and death, but I guess there is a way to deal with both. And thanks for
That's right.
telling us how. Yeah.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks for the opportunity.